Well, greetings, everyone. The idea today is to introduce some basic aspects, some basic information about kind of history and historiography. So let me just share my presentation with you very quickly. There you go. So this is an initial approach to Chicano history, which has developed in a context of racism and suspicion against Mexican Americans, regardless of their origin, whether Mexican Americans can trace their origins back to the colonial period or even the pre-colonial period, or whether there are the descendants of those Mexicans who were already settled in what is now the United States of New Mexico, California, Texas, etc. Or even if they are the descendants of Mexican immigrants who came later to the United States, even in recent years in the 20th century. They have all been subjected, or most of them have been subjected to racism and discrimination in the United States on account of their ethnicity. And when we talk about Chicano, we are considering all of this context. Now, the article that I'm basing my presentation on, and I'll provide you with the bibliographical information at the end, mainly asks three questions about Chicano historiography: what forces engender the Mexican ethnic community in the United States, who comprises it, and how the past bears on the present. There's a strong emphasis on how understanding the past may help us understand the present situation of Chicanos in the United States. Talking about early 20th century, historiography started as with a focus on a fantasy heritage, with derogatory depictions of Mexican Americans and historical accounts that totally erased their contributions to society and to the development of the United States as a country. Later in the 1930s and 40s, historians started to challenge these depictions, and we started to see more realistic portrayals of Mexican Americans in the United States, and especially after this period, some Chicano historians themselves started to get involved and undertaking the tasks of recovering the history of their own traditions and their own heritage. So Chicano history emerged as a field later in the early 1970s after the militant actions that took place in the 1960s, not only in the Chicano context, but also in other contexts. But the activism of the 1960s helped the Chicano voice be heard more loudly. And in the 1970s, a more real Chicano history started to unravel and being discovered. It was engendered by the Chicano movement of the 60s to gain safe knowledge. So I'm going to mention a few authors and a few historians that Ernesto Chavez, the author of the article that I'm summarizing, quotes. One important one is Juan Gomez Quiñones. He says, color, class, and culture determine Chicanos' special relationship to American society. We know this. If it weren't because of the color of their skin or their social class that was pretty much imposed on them ever since the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, we wouldn't have the same idea of Chicanos that we have today. They were determined by these factors: their culture, their class, and their color. According to Quiñones, however, these new approaches to Chicano history were marked by innovation, new methods, an attempt to reconstruct and reinterpret the original sources that had been used in previous historical accounts of Chicano culture. And also, this is a newer tradition of self-definition of a people. The Chicanos are embracing even the term Chicano and appropriating it to identify themselves and redefine themselves in their own terms. Another important historian, Rodolfo Acuña, says Chicanos are colonized people in the United States. This is an interesting quote because usually we think of the colonization taking place in other areas, in other geographical areas and not in the first world countries. But this is a type of colonization that is taking place within the same country, within the United States. It happened as the United States won the Mexican-American War in the mid 19th century, but also it's happening today, right? As it has been colonizing different peoples culturally and linguistically. Well, Chicanos are not the exception. There's a domination of the Anglo-American colonizers, but what Rodolfo Acuña says, this has been supported even by Chicanos themselves. So they have been accepting it. They have been acquiescing to this colonization, and this is something that he criticizes as well. So after the Mexican-American War, we have a context in which there is an unequal status for ethnic Americans in the United States. There was a process of displacement and downward mobility. So the United States won the war, and all these people who were already there in their Mexican country were suddenly and very violently, let's say, part of a new country. Now they're not Mexicans. Now they are part of the United States, but not in a very privileged or in a very advantageous situation, right? They are moving downward in their position in a new society that looks down upon them. Albert Caramillo says that the cause of the situation of Chicanos in the United States is not just a cultural clash, like the Anglo-Americans try to explain, but the growth of capitalism in the late 19th century, because the Chicanos entered the labor market at the bottom. Okay, they were unskilled workers, and they didn't have access to the skilled occupations like the Anglo-Americans have. So they didn't have any opportunity to grow upwards in the social scale, but they were simply unskilled workers, and they entered this new reality of capitalism at a very disadvantageous position. Class and race determined Chicano's subordinate position as workers, says Caramillo. Also, something that is very important is up to this point, Chicano historians have been focusing on men, mainly in big cities. So they're disregarding other rural areas, and they're definitely disregarding women. So they're not taking into consideration the sexual discrimination of ethnic Mexican women. And in the academy, that was particularly so. It took a long time for Mexican-American women to win their place, to gain a position of respect in the academy. One of these women was Judith Sweeney. She started to, she says that the starting point of Chicana history was the Spanish conquest. And in this, she focused on the character of La Malinche, right? Malitzin Tenepal, also called Doña Marina. So she considered La Malinche proto-Chicana, and she started to deconstruct the traditional view of La Malinche as a traitor. She considered her a hero. Adelaida del Castillo follows the same train of thought, and she says La Malinche is an actual force in the making of history, the mother of mestizos. She was a linguist. She was a resourceful woman. She was smart enough to incorporate the elements of her own culture and the elements of the colonizers, and to take advantage of that dialogue between the two in order to construct the Chicano identity. Cynthia Orozco, another Chicano theorist, is inspired by the developments in U.S. women's history, and she proposes that new questions must be asked about Chicano culture, but from the perspective of women. There's a focus outside the cities. Now they're only focusing not only on women, but also on rural areas. And she says that women contribute with a transnational perspective that the male counterparts were not considering. Vicky Ruiz talks about the efforts of Chicana laborers to improve their lives, and she does studies that are more spot on, more individual, about individual women and how they struggled and how they survived, and how they use the resources available to help their families to improve, their family lives improve. Okay, now in the 1990s, we have what is called the postmodern Mexican American history. It's more dynamic, it's multifaceted community that is acknowledged. One of the proponents is Ramon Gutierrez. He says Chicano history is informed by cultural theory. He focuses on Pueblo, the Pueblo and the Puebloans, who are the indigenous inhabitants of New Mexico, California, mainly. And so he focuses on the Chicano identity as coming from the indigenous inhabitants of these territories, not so much on the Mexican origins of their ethnia. George Sanchez, on the other hand, focuses on ethnic Mexicans' agency and quest to acculturate. This is more contemporary approaches to Chicano history, as looking upon the possibilities for agency and how they incorporate, how they acculturate, and how they integrate themselves into mainstream American culture. Obviously, the nature of this relationship is one that places Chicanos between two worlds, right in the hyphen between Mexican and American. In the 2000s, there's seeking to locate forces and spaces of racialization of ethnic Americans in the United States. That is asking what are the factors, what are the aspects that are contributing to the racialization of Mexican Americans, and where is this taking place? Mexican Americans are a racialized people with a unique but fundamentally common history, which is not the same for Latino history at large. There's not a singular group with one historical experience. There are Cubans, there are Puerto Ricans, there are Mexicans, of course, there are Guatemalans, there are other Latino groups in the United States, and they don't share the same unity that some Chicanos or that Chicano culture shares, even though Chicano culture continues to be very dynamic and very diverse. There's no singular ethnic Mexican historical experience and not a sole community. However, there's a unity of approach, says Chavez, to understand the present through an examination of the past. Both natives and aliens, this is the between two worlds characteristic of the Chicano experience, is a unique standing, says Chavez, because there are natives to this land, but aliens in terms of culture and how they've been discriminated against and how they've been looked down upon by Anglo-American mainstream culture in general. Also, Chavez ends by saying there's not a sole insurgency, but many insurgencies bound in one political language of Chicanismo. So even though there's a lot of diversity in the Chicano experience, there's a unity in the approach and there's a unity in the political language that is used. So gracias. And this is the source of my presentation, which is also available in Mediación Virtual for you to read by yourselves. Okay, so see you soon. Bye-bye.